Hey everybody, Trey here. Welcome back to another video. Back with an updated forecast discussion on this weekend's potentially significant severe weather outbreak across a large swath of the eastern half of the U.S. We've had some new data come in. We've gotten a little bit more clarity on what may occur with this particular setup, so wanted to come back and do an updated forecast discussion, give you some of my new thoughts on the potential outcomes for this Friday into the weekend system. Here's what we have right now from the Storm Prediction Center. This is for the day 3 outlook, so for our Friday portion of the setup. We have now an enhanced risk, level 3 out of 5, across a very broad swath of the east central U.S., basically from north central Illinois into southeast Iowa and southward through Missouri, western Kentucky and Tennessee, eastern Arkansas over toward northern Mississippi and northwest Alabama. So a very broad swath under the gun for that greatest severe weather risk on Friday, surrounded by a large slight level 2 out of 5 and marginal level 1 out of 5 in the yellow and dark green areas respectively. So very lots of folks going to be under the gun for the Friday system. It is starting to look a little bit more like a QLCS threat for the most part, especially in northern portions of the risk area. We will get to that here in just a second. But the bottom line is that a lot of people are going to be under the gun for this Friday system, and so wanted to make sure we get the new thoughts on that. Significant severe weather has been outlined as well in the hatched region there, 30% hatched for significant severe weather coinciding with that enhanced risk. Then we move into Saturday, day 4, the 15th, and we are seeing, again, a very broad severe weather risk with the greatest threat focusing on that southeast U.S. corridor, basically eastern Louisiana through Mississippi, basically all of Alabama, western Georgia, southeast Tennessee into the Florida Panhandle. That is where the greatest threat for severe weather is expected to be on Saturday, and Saturday is starting to shape up to be potentially a very high-end severe weather threat. Again, still a few days out, so lots to work out, and we'll go over the setup here in just a minute, but based on what I'm seeing right now, Saturday could be the day of this 3-day stretch that is going to stretch into Sunday, the 16th, across the Eastern Seaboard, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, southward all the way into Florida, with a threat for severe weather on Sunday. So let's go ahead and dive right in. As we usually do a few days out from a particular setup, we are going to take a look at our NAM, 12Z NAM, 6Z GFS, and our 6Z European model. We're going to compare and contrast these models and show you if there's any model discrepancy that remains. Again, we're 3 to 4 days out from this setup, so want to see how the model discrepancy is doing and give us a range of outcomes that might happen. Again, we're starting to hone in on a potential solution here for this upcoming setup. So let's go ahead and dive in. Before we do that, though, I want to just bring to your attention very briefly that we do have a severe weather risk for today across the Arklatex region. That slight risk you see there in the yellow shading is out for the Arklatex region, southeast Oklahoma, northeast Texas, northwest Louisiana, western Arkansas, including the Dallas area up toward Ardmore, Oklahoma, eastward toward McAllister, and then over toward Shreveport. You are in the slight risk for today. Is going to be a low-end threat for severe weather as that lead shortwave we've been talking about acts upon a developing dry line. We may get to some moisture return up in toward the Red River, eastern Oklahoma, western Arkansas, to provide for enough juice to provide to initiate storms this afternoon. Mostly going to be a large hail threat with those storms, perhaps very large hail, 2+ inch in diameter hailstones within the yellow stippled region there, alongside some damaging winds, and a very low-end risk for a tornado or two out across that area today. Then the setup moves into tomorrow, very brief, low-end risk with that across, centered on mostly Alabama tomorrow. Marginal risk out for that for a chance for a brief tornado or damaging wind gust there. And then we get into Friday, and that is when our system begins. So let's go ahead and start here. We'll start off with the 12Z NAM from this morning at 500 millibars, as we always do. And there is that lead shortwave, that little bit of a lead shortwave we've been talking about that is kind of going to be somewhat of a saving grace for the Friday system, not allowing that moisture to make its way, really, at least real robust moisture, to make its way all the way up into the upper Midwest, Great Lakes region. That is going to traverse the region today, provide that severe weather threat for the Arklatex in the this afternoon, move through the southeast tomorrow, and then we see our big behemoth of a trough back here across the west U.S. That is going to be our next trough that will be our main weather maker for this upcoming weekend system. You see it takes on a very much negative tilt very early on in its progression here, very much a negative tilt there. Strong flow rounding the base of this trough. That flow continues to round the base of that trough going into Friday, and here's where we are Friday morning. Once again, very strong negative tilt to that trough, very strong jet streak that has strengthened with time going into Friday. And then here we are going into Friday afternoon. This is 21Z Friday, so 4 p.m. Central Daylight Time on Friday. It has become pretty much a very compact but very potent trough moving through the central U.S., putting that exit region really right over a broad area from the Midwest all the way southward into the Mid-South and eventually the Southeast. This is just a pretty textbook look for a severe weather setup. Again, if we didn't have that lead wave scouring the moisture a little bit, we'll take a look at the moisture in just a second. We would be talking about a real high-end event for Friday as well as Saturday. But Friday is going to be a little bit moisture-starved, especially with areas to the north. But still, with this amount of dynamics at play, this strong of a trough at play, that is going to help overcome that lack of moisture a little bit to provide for a robust severe weather threat as far north as the Midwest and even perhaps the Great Lakes region. So very strong negatively tilted trough there, very strong jet streak. This is just a classic look for severe weather. And then as we go into the evening, kind of moves off, ejects off to the northeast, kind of it starts to take on the occlusion process a little bit. And it'll eject off to the northeast, and then will be replaced by this just broad troughing out here as we go into Saturday. We're going to start with Friday. We'll get to Saturday in a second, but this looks to be the Friday progression there. A little bit more of a glancing blow with this trough farther to the south, so that could be something to watch for the southern portions of the risk area going into Friday evening. But we'll expand on that here in just a second. So let's go back to 21Z, so 4 p.m. Central Daylight Time. That is where the trough is on the NAM. Again, very favorable look for significant severe weather there. GFS. GFS takes that trough, the lead shortwave, off to the east, and very similar progression to what the NAM was showing. It takes on a nice negative tilt with time. 21Z on Friday, centered right there over northeast Kansas. Very strong jet streak rounding the base of that trough. So here we are. It's centered right there on the GFS. We go back to the NAM. NAM certainly a little bit, just slightly slower with the progression of the trough. Not all that surprising, as we've talked about before. The NAM tends to be a little bit on the slower side with the progression of the pertinent features, whereas the GFS tends to be the most progressive of the models. But we're starting to hone in a little bit. That difference between the two is a little bit smaller than what we saw a couple days ago. So the overall timing looks to be starting to hone in on a single solution, but overall the idea is very much the same. Very strong, negatively tilted trough making its way into the Midwest and Mid-South by the afternoon on Friday. European model, same situation here, negative tilt to that trough very early on, and then we get a nice ejection of that trough by 21Z on Friday into the Central Plains. European model, GFS model, kind of on the same page here. The NAM's certainly the slowest of the three, but overall we're pretty clustered right in this area. Somewhere in the eastern half of Kansas looks to be where that center of the 500 millibar cyclone is among these models at 4 p.m. Central on Friday afternoon. So again, that's going to provide plenty of dynamics here. The exit region of this trough very much centered over that mid-south to midwest region, and that will be where the strongest forcing is going to be located on Friday evening. Very strong forcing with this very highly dynamic system. So this is why, one of the reasons why it looks to be perhaps more of a QLCS threat, very robust QLCS threat, because we have so much forcing. We'll take a look at our surface map here in just a second. But overall, the idea is very much the same among these models. Very strong, negatively tilted trough, ejecting somewhere into the Central Plains and Midwest and Mid-South by the afternoon on Friday. Let's go down to the surface now. We'll back it up here to our current sector, or our current time frame, and then we will take a look at the surface among our models here. So let's start with the NAM. We'll go back to the NAM at the surface. Weak surface low has already started to develop this morning across parts of Oklahoma ahead of that lead shortwave, and that is going to continue through the day today. A little bit of a deepening of the surface low out there across western Oklahoma into the Texas Panhandle, at least on the NAM by this afternoon. That surface low kind of washes out, moves off to the east a little bit, but very much washes out as we go into the day tomorrow. And then we start to see really robust cyclogenesis out here, out across the high plains. You see very broad surface cyclone out here across the central to northern high plains through the day on Thursday. And then as we go into Friday, that is when we really start to see surface low development out there across these central high plains. This is 15Z Friday, surface low developing across eastern Colorado, western Kansas. That pressure gradient very, very tight across the plains. And again, that is one of the things we mentioned. What seems to be a certainty with this setup is that we're going to see a very strong, rapidly deepening low-level cyclone, which is going to allow for strong gradient or non-thunderstorm winds across a broad portion of the U.S. The Midwest, northern plains, Great Lakes, all the way down into the southern plains. Very, very tight pressure gradient here, which will allow for those non-thunderstorm winds to be extremely strong. So our models, once again, continue to really bomb out this cyclone to the mid-970s, it looks like, by 21Z. Our low center somewhere there in northern Kansas, and that is going to allow for a fairly decently sized warm sector, at least in the meridional direction, north-south direction. With eastward and westward extent, it's a little bit more pinched off, as we talked about in our most recent video. We'll talk about that here in a second as we go into the moisture profiles. But overall, a broad area where we have at least modest moisture to support severe weather ahead of this rapidly deepening surface low going into Friday afternoon. We go into the evening, that low starts to eject off to the north into the Great Lakes region, setting the stage for our Saturday severe weather threat across the southeast. So 21Z surface low centered there in northern Kansas. Let's take a look at the GFS. GFS, much of the same. Surface low develops today, kind of washes out as we go into tomorrow. Broad surface cyclogenesis there going into Thursday, and then by Friday morning, very strong surface low development there across the eastern Colorado vicinity. Then we move into 21Z, and we see this is what we have there. Surface low, maybe just a tad off to the northeast compared to the NAM, but overall very similar location. A little bit of a broader cyclone here, maybe not quite as tight there at the center as what we saw with the NAM. You see that closed contour there at the center with the NAM, not so much with the GFS. Overall, very similar solution, would provide for a broad warm sector. You see those 70s temperatures extending all the way up almost to Minnesota, Wisconsin. So a very broad region where we will have a nice warm low-level air mass to support severe weather ahead of the surface low. Again, take a look at the very strong pressure gradient. Gradient winds going to be a concern, and fire weather certainly going to be a concern as we go into the next several days, given the very strong winds and availability of fuels here at the surface across a broad swath of the U.S., particularly across the southern plains into Texas there. Extreme fire weather conditions are likely to present themselves. We have an extreme fire weather risk out from the SPC today for that southwest Texas area, and that is only going to continue into the next several days as this very strong cyclone develops. All right, European model. Much of the same story here. And then Friday morning, nice surface cyclogenesis there across eastern Colorado. European model appears to be a little bit farther back than the other two, interestingly enough. The NAM and the GFS certainly more on board with each other. The European model certainly a little bit back to the south, or back to the southwest there, across western Kansas almost, or northwestern Kansas, where the center of the surface low is, would push things back to the west ever so slightly into maybe eastern portions of the plains there, far eastern Nebraska, eastern Kansas, whereas the other two solutions would be a little bit farther off to the east, basically where the SPC has it for the day 3 outlook, east of that, east of the Kansas-Oklahoma border, going into the Midwest, Mid-South, and Southeast. But overall, it is clear that we're going to see a very strong, rapidly deepening cyclone here into the mid-970s millibars, perhaps, and that is going to lead to plenty of dynamics, both in the low levels and in the deep layer, to support robust severe weather over a broad region. So we go further in time. Again, that low kind of ejects off to the north. We will maintain a little bit less forcing down to the south, removed from the center of the surface low going into the evening on Saturday. All the models show that as well. And so that could be a continuation there into the southeast, more of a glancing blow down here from the upper trough and a little bit farther removed from the strongest flow, strongest forcing with the surface low. Could lead to an area to watch Friday evening into early Saturday morning across the mid-south and southeast there. All right, so let's go ahead and take a look at our moisture return. So once again, I'll just keep it on the CONUS sector here, but we start today, once again, those 60 dew points situated right off the Gulf Coast there. We start to get that up into the Arklatex region going into the day today, but you see as we go into tomorrow, that moisture gets a little bit swept off to the east, although maybe not as much as we initially thought, but perhaps that moisture is a little bit on the lower quality side. Taking a look at our soundings here today, I just want to very quickly show you the sounding from today. This is going to be the sounding at Fort Worth. You see how shallow this moisture is, even down to the south at Corpus Christi, very shallow moisture for these regions. So initially, this moist air mass is going to be more on the shallow side, somewhat lower quality. That will change as we go into the next several days. So even though we see maybe a little bit more of a northward advance of the 60s dew points, it might not be all that high quality of moisture here. So not too much of a difference from what we're seeing over the past few days. And we really don't see any super robust advance of the 60s dew points past really the kind of the I-40 corridor there in Arkansas going into the afternoon on Friday. This is at 4 p.m. on Friday. You do see, though, broad area of low to mid 50s dew points here. That is on the low side, certainly, and will, again, keep this from being a real upper echelon event up there as far as a supercell tornado risk. But overall, it is enough moisture to support robust severe weather, especially with the amount of dynamics at play. And those 60s dew points, we do have there across the southeast a nice reservoir of low to mid 60s dew points. And again, that could be somewhere to watch across the mid-south and southeast going into the evening hours on Friday as that warm sector kind of gets going. So let's take a let's take a look at the GFS here real quick. Let me zoom back out and see what the moisture return is looking like on the GFS. So here we are today. That 60s dew points get off to the north quite a bit. Going in, so definitely a difference between the NAM and the GFS. The GFS does not maintain those 60s dew points across the mid-south and southeast like the NAM did. This is tomorrow afternoon at 4 p.m. Central. Let me zoom out here so we can directly compare. The NAM maintains those 50s and those 60s dew points all the way up into the kind of the Memphis area, Paducah, Kentucky area, and with a more robust moisture reservoir down to the south across Louisiana and Mississippi, whereas the GFS at the same time really scours out that moisture pretty significantly. So definitely a difference in how the moisture is being handled here among these two models. You know, I tend at this point to maybe take a middle ground here. The GFS, this is not all that surprising with the GFS. It tends to be a little bit less robust, less aggressive with the moisture. The NAM sometimes tends to be a little bit more aggressive with the quality of the moisture here at the surface. So maybe a middle ground might be somewhere, something to keep in mind with this progression here. But going into the day on Friday, we start to get that northward advance of moisture in a very narrow swath. So you see much worse moisture up to the north, mid to upper 40s and low 50s dew points across a broad swath of the Midwest and Great Lakes region. Whereas what we saw on the NAM at that same time, 4 p.m. Friday, much more robust moisture off to the north. And so the NAM solution here would certainly be a more robust severe weather environment with quite a bit higher moisture, 4, 5, 6, 7 degrees better moisture, better dew points here at the surface across the Midwest than the GFS is showing. I tend to think the GFS is a little bit out to lunch here. I would expect to see perhaps a little bit better moisture making its way up here. The NAM seems to be a little bit closer to a more favorable solution. Let's see what the European model has to say and see what it shows. So the Euro model, definitely more so on the NAM. You see it's kind of the middle ground we were talking about here. The GFS really sweeps those dew points out into the Gulf tomorrow. You see those 60s dew points basically just confined to the very coastal regions there, whereas the European model has a little bit farther northward advance, kind of somewhat of a middle ground between. The NAM certainly is the most aggressive of these by far, with keeping those 60s dew points inland. So perhaps a little bit, the NAM may be a little bit out to lunch, and we may be seeing a little bit more of a Euro GFS solution, but I think still I would lean toward maybe a little bit more robust moisture here hanging around, especially if the cold front associated with today's surface low is not all that strong, which doesn't look like it is going to be. Not a very strong temperature gradient across the boundary today. So a little bit of discrepancy still in the moisture return. Overall, the idea by Friday is somewhat the same, as we have fairly good moisture down to the south. And let's go on the Euro model. The Euro model, definitely the worst of the three. GFS even gets those 60s dew points up into eastern Arkansas, albeit in somewhat of a pinched warm sector. But the Euro model, very, very poor in that regard, with those 60 dew points barely reaching the Louisiana-Arkansas border. So we are still dealing with some model discrepancy here. The NAM, certainly the most robust of the three solutions at this point, would provide a more robust severe weather threat off to the north, as well as down to the south, with a little bit wider warm sector, a little bit better moisture down there compared to these models. Let's real quick just go to our ensemble models. I just want to take a look at that real quick and see if perhaps this Euro run or the GFS run is a little bit of an outlier compared to the average. Again, we talked about what the ensemble models are in our last video. Basically takes an average of all the members of the ensemble that have slightly different conditions associated with them to give us sort of an average of things. So this is the European model ensemble. And it definitely shows a little bit more robust moisture here up into eastern Arkansas. So it appears that this European model run is perhaps a slight outlier here in it being a little bit less aggressive with the moisture. The overall ensemble, and this is the 0Z ensemble from last night. Unfortunately, I don't have access to the 6Z, but we do see a little bit more robust moisture return with the 0Z run than we do with this the deterministic run here of the Euro. Let's take a look at the GFS as well. I just want to take a look at the GFS ensemble real quick. We'll take a look at our 6Z run there. And so let's see, GFS 6Z so that is going to be Friday at 18Z, Friday at 0Z, or Saturday 0Z, so 7 p.m., and definitely a little bit more robust moisture. So the GFS solution looks to be fairly on par with its the ensemble average, but the European model, this particular operational run, may be a little bit on the meager side compared to its ensemble members. So just something to keep in mind there. We talked about the importance of ensemble forecasting. We're starting to get into that range where the deterministic runs, these individual single model runs, can be a little bit more accurate than they have been. But still, you can see the European model definitely on the low end compared to its average within the ensembles. So with that said, let's take a few soundings from across the region. We'll take one here across maybe eastern Iowa, one up here into the kind of Missouri Boot Heel vicinity, and then one down here out across the Mid-South. So this is going to be 21Z, 4 p.m. Central on Friday. And this is why the moisture is going to be a little bit of a problem up here. Now, I do suspect that these surface temperatures may be a little bit cool, as what the NAM typically shows, but you see that capping sticking around here. We do have a lot of forcing, so I suspect that it's not going to be too much of a concern getting storm development, even with this capping hanging around on the NAM. This is, again, for that eastern Iowa vicinity, somewhere right in here. So eastern Iowa right there. Ahead of the surface low, we'll have plenty of forcing to allow storms to go along the boundaries and ahead of the surface low. But overall, decent instability, 1,100 joules per kilogram mixed layer CAPE, so enough instability to support severe weather. Overall, not a super awesome look for real robust severe weather there on the hodograph. We do have some curvature in the low levels there, enough deep layer shear to support robust organized convection. But overall, not a hugely favorable look, but with as much forcing as we have enough instability and deep layer shear to support a robust severe threat there. Here we are in the Mid-South, southeast Missouri at 21Z Friday. Still decent instability, a lot of dry air aloft here. So again, that's probably a product of how initially dry the overall atmosphere is based on our current soundings. So it hasn't maybe fully modified yet, given that initial lead shortwave, kind of mixing the environment with some of that drier air aloft. 72 over 59 at the surface. This would be uncapped, so we would have enough instability for robust storms. Wind profiles, not super impressive. Deep layer shear, certainly strong. Low level shear, not all that strong, but would support some type of damaging wind and maybe tornado risk. But again, with so much forcing, I think this is going to be a very much QLCS type threat. Strong surface low, strong 500 millibar trough here. So I would suspect that we're going to see just a lot of storms developing all at once with a very strongly forced QLCS here going into the afternoon on Friday. This is the southeast. You see it does remain somewhat capped here on the NAM through the day, and we probably won't have a ton of forcing across the southeast until the evening. You see here, this was from kind of this region here. So we're kind of a little bit removed from the overall trough at this point. You see by evening, we start to see that impinge upon the region, that stronger flow. We would be in the right entrance region here of our jet streak. So by early to mid-evening, the profiles look pretty solid across this region. Again, early on, not a lot of instability. I do wonder if we were to take a sounding here out across kind of northern Mississippi at this time. This is 3Z, so 10 p.m. Central Daylight Time. This might be an area to watch going into the evening on Friday. And you see there, decent instability. Again, lots of dry air aloft, but a little bit of capping remaining. But overall, we do have some instability with strong low-level flow, very strong low-level flow there, effective storm relative helicity in excess of 400 meters squared per second squared. So that could be an area to watch Friday evening if we can get perhaps some discrete supercells to fire down here just on the southern edge of the ejecting trough. We have enough moisture here to support that, at least on the NAM run, so that could be something to watch for Friday. So again, it looks like Friday to me, early on, kind of mid-afternoon or so, we'll have that low really deepening, that trough moving in. Probably storms start to develop across Iowa, Missouri, into Illinois, Arkansas there. Not quite as robust moisture, but overall, we should see those storms develop. Again, with so much forcing, I think it's just going to be a very quick transition to more of a line up here with some embedded tornado risk and damaging wind risk. And then down to the south, going into the evening, we'll have to watch that threat across southeast Arkansas, Louisiana, Mississippi. If we can get a broader warm sector like what the NAM is showing, that could be an area to watch for more discrete development, supercell development that could pose a perhaps strong tornado risk as well as a damaging wind risk there on Friday evening. Let's take a look at the GFS real quick here. Just a couple of soundings for you in those same areas as what we were watching on the NAM. One down here maybe, and then that should be good. So this is going to be at 21Z Friday, and then we'll take one here, kind of northern Mississippi. That warm sector does expand with time into the overnight hours, Friday into Saturday morning. Here is eastern Iowa, decent instability, a little bit wonky there of the profile, some convective contamination you see on the sounding. Overall, a profile that would favor that significant damaging wind and tornado risk with that potential squall line. Down to the south, once again, the thermo profiles, lots of dry air aloft still, so that may hamper things just a little bit down to the south with very limited low-level instability here, but enough forcing to initiate storms down into Missouri and Arkansas. And then going into the evening hours, not quite as robust as what the NAM was showing, but certainly this would favor, perhaps if storms can fire there across northern Mississippi, Louisiana, Arkansas, overnight, late Friday night into Saturday morning, could see that tornado risk present itself with any storms that do fire there. Then we go into Saturday, and again, Saturday is looking like a really robust day as far as severe weather goes. So we'll start these, we'll go back to 0Z Saturday, so 7 p.m. on Friday, and then we'll kind of go from there. We'll go back to 500 millibars. And so here we go. So this is going to be starting at 0Z, so 7 p.m. Friday. That trough, as we talked about, the main trough is going to eject off to the north, start that occlusion process, and then behind it, we're kind of just left with this broad troughing out here across the southern U.S. Broad, sort of long wave-ish trough here. But we do perhaps have a little bit of an embedded shortwave here. You see by 0Z, we start on the NAM to get a little bit of this shortwave right in here. Perhaps a little bit more of a negative tilt with that shortwave starts to move into this region of the southeast. And really we're left with just this broad southwesterly flow ahead of this potential shortwave. And this is something, one of the boxes that I always look for to check with a southeast setup is a little bit less intense forcing, a little bit more just broad southwesterly flow. And certainly this event looks to have it. This is the NAM solution for Saturday afternoon. And that is definitely a look that is somewhat concerning for the severe weather event on Saturday. Not quite as much forcing, more just broad southwesterly flow, a little bit of a short wave in here perhaps, might be just enough to initiate slightly more discrete convection out here on Saturday. GFS, much of the same here. You see we get this short wave to swing through during the afternoon. 0Z here. Nice little strong belt of flow, perhaps a little bit of that short wave right in there, impinging upon the region very much there, Mississippi, Alabama, Louisiana. So this look is certainly concerning, and just from a 500 millibar trough perspective, Definitely a classic look for a southeast type significant severe weather event. European model, definitely a little on the slow side, a little bit less negatively tilted than what the other models were showing. So we are seeing some discrepancy in the overall depiction of the 500 millibar trough on Saturday here. But overall, we should have broad southwesterly flow across this region, and that could be enough if we have any little short waves embedded within the flow to initiate storms on Saturday. Let's go down to the surface. So we'll go back to 0Z on Saturday, so 7 p.m. Friday. We'll take a look at how our surface low progresses. So here we are, Friday evening into Saturday. That surface low get right there across the east central plains, going to start its occlusion process there, moving off to the north and down to the south. We're left with just this kind of broad surface troughing out in here, your frontal boundary, perhaps somewhere out in this vicinity here. And then out ahead of that, we have perhaps some troughing in the open warm sector, which could lead to some extra forcing to allow for open warm sector development to take place. Perhaps even a little bit of a surface low that develops here. I suspect this is kind of convectively contaminated right in there, but the SPC did mention the development of a secondary surface low out across the mid-south and southeast on Saturday. So could be a little bit of secondary surface low development out in here. If that happens, that would really help to back the low-level flow, keep that warm sector fairly broad to support a long-duration, robust severe weather threat on Saturday. GFS, much of the same. It looks like we do kind of get that secondary center to develop, although, again, I think that is somewhat to do with the ongoing convection Friday into Saturday. One of the things we'll have to work out is the progression of the convection Friday into Saturday, how that happens. If we get a lot of overnight convection in the warm sector, that could lead to a less robust severe threat on Saturday. But if that warm sector remains fairly pristine without a lot of convection, then we could be in for a pretty robust day on Saturday. European model, much of the same as well. A lot more convection on the European model. You see a lot cooler temperatures here out across the warm sector on the Euro on Saturday. Those 70s temperatures, those darker reds, confined a little bit farther south than the other two models. So the European model looks like it is depicting a lot more warm sector convection. That would lead to a more truncated warm sector and less less real estate to support robust warm sector development. Let's take a look at our moisture now going into Saturday. So I'm going to zoom in here to the southeast sector on these so we can get a bit closer of a view. Let me just do that here, and then the European model, we'll go ahead and take a look at that. And we'll see how this progresses. So, NAM model, let me go to the southeast sector on the Euro. All right, NAM model here. Again, it was the most aggressive with the moisture kind of sticking around going into our event Friday into Saturday, but a robust reservoir of moisture down here across the southeast. And then as we go into the day on Saturday, we see nice 60s and 70s dew points across a decent swath of Alabama, Mississippi, into Louisiana. Very rich moisture in the low levels here out across these regions. This is 21Z. We don't see a ton of convection. Lower dew points up here to the north perhaps signifies some ongoing convection off to the north there, convectively contaminated air mass here, but down to the south of that, that could lead to an uninterrupted warm sector down here across this region. GFS also shows a very similar solution with a fairly broad warm sector here out across Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama going into the afternoon on Saturday. So this would certainly provide enough real estate for perhaps some rounds, if there are any confluence bands in the open warm sector, plenty of real estate for those to come to fruition and produce tornadic supercells there with a decently broad warm sector. Again, rich moisture here, very similar solution to what the NAM is showing. Going into the afternoon. GFS is even a little bit more unsullied warm sector than what the NAM was showing. NAM has a little bit of convection here, 21Z, kind of slightly truncating the warm sector, but down here, GFS, this would be a very concerning situation with a broad warm sector, just broad southwesterly flow aloft. That is a fairly classic look for a southeast type setup. Let's go ahead and go to the southeast here, European model. The Euro model. So you see the European model, the difference here is that we have our upper 60s and 70s dew points truncated very far south, southern Louisiana, southern Mississippi, southern Alabama, whereas up here, much less robust moisture. Those dew points have dropped off, likely due to a lot of convective activity during the morning hours here out across these areas. But overall, decently broad warm sector on the NAM and GFS would support that threat for perhaps multiple rounds of severe weather as that warm sector maintains itself inland. One thing I always like to look for here is the elevated mixed layer out across the southeast. Usually your best southeast setups have a nice elevated mixed layer to kind of hold off convection during the morning. So let's take a look at the mid-level relative humidity going into Saturday morning, and you see a decent amount of dry air here out across this region. The whites here, this is relative humidity, so the whites and blues are your higher relative humidity. The red colors, the reds and darker kind of black colors, those are your drier colors for drier air. And you see a lot of dry air here on the NAM at 700 millibars, kind of your mid-levels where that capping and any capping inversion might, or EML might be located. Pretty dry air here aloft. On the NAM, the GFS, let's take a look at that and see if there's any elevated mixed layer here to work with. And we do see a decent amount of dry air out across this region early on in the morning. We do see it kind of moisten through the afternoon, but overall, this is a pretty decent look here. Let's take a look at mid-level lapse rates. We'll look at some soundings here in just a second, some forecast soundings, but mid-level lapse rates, you see a decent plume of mid-level lapse rates, about 7.5 to 8, those yellow colors, out across this area Saturday morning, and they kind of maintain themselves, interestingly enough, through the day. That could lead to really significant instability across this corridor, and that's something that is a big checkbox that I use with these southeast setups. Is the thermodynamic profile favorable? And that usually means some drier air aloft and that elevated mixed layer holding things off into the afternoon. GFS here, let's take a look at the lapse rates, and we see, that is very impressive lapse rates, 7.5 to 8, almost 8.5 degrees Celsius per kilometer across this region of Louisiana, Mississippi, and Alabama through the morning on the GFS. So that is a very promising signal. I would suspect the European model may not show that as much because it likely has a lot more convection here going off to the north. And unfortunately, we don't have the lapse rates here on the COD version of the Euro, but GFS and NAM showing a pretty robust thermodynamic environment out across this region going into Saturday. So let's take a couple soundings here. So for Saturday, we'll likely have that convection ongoing from Friday night. That is one of the uncertainties here with Friday into Saturday, how that Friday convection persists into Saturday. But we do have a broad warm sector, so let's take a sounding out here in the warm sector, perhaps southern Mississippi here. And then we'll take one on the GFS as well, 21Z, and we'll take one out in here, southeast Mississippi. So this is the NAM for southern Mississippi, and my goodness, this is extremely impressive. Wow. This is the first time I pulled a sounding here for Saturday, and this is an upper echelon type environment for the southeast. Very robust instability, 2,700 joules per kilogram mixed layer cake. That is pretty strong for the southeast. Not often you see that. Some drier air aloft. Your typical sort of football goalpost type sounding, not quite a loaded gun, but some drier air aloft to really increase that instability with a decently deep low-level moist layer, not super deep like we often see in the southeast. This is almost a very plains-like thermodynamic environment. Very strong low-level instability as well, 3 Cape in excess of 150 joules per kilogram. Your low-level and mid-level lapse rates, you see there, 3 to 6 kilometer lapse rate, 8 degrees Celsius per kilometer. That is impressive for the southeast. And your low-level lapse rates, 0 to 3 kilometer lapse rate, almost 7 degrees Celsius per kilometer. So that thermodynamic profile is about as pristine as it gets for the southeast, and you couple that with this kind of a wind profile. Look at the clockwise curvature in the low levels of the hodograph, strong veering and strengthening of the winds with height, strong deep layer shear. This type of environment is associated with a lot of your high-end southeast tornado outbreaks. So if this comes to fruition, again, I don't like to hype these setups up, but the data that we're seeing for Saturday now is coming in quite concerning for a potentially very high ceiling event here. Again, it hinges on what happens with the Friday convection going into Saturday, and if we can get convection in the warm sector to develop out ahead of the Friday, what's left over from Friday. If the warm sector can remain this pristine going into the afternoon on Saturday, we could be talking about a very significant outbreak of severe weather, including the potential for significant tornadoes with this kind of a profile here. Even the GFS is on board. Now, the GFS is a lot more saturated here with the profile, not as much dry air aloft really at all, and that's kind of a GFS quirk. But still, we have fairly robust instability, 1,700 joules per kilogram mixed layer CAPE with a wind profile that would favor significant tornadoes, almost 470 meter square per second squared effective SRH with strong bearing and strengthening of the winds with height. The wind profile certainly would be favorable for significant tornadoes. And if this kind of an instability profile comes to fruition, even this on the GFS, if we can get some of that drier air aloft to work its way in, that would be a very concerning look for a significant severe weather event across Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama in particular on Saturday. Let's go back here. I want to just check here the EML across this region here. So we'll take a sounding across southern Mississippi at 12Z on the NAM on Saturday morning. And we'll like to see that kind of loaded gun profile with some capping holding things off. And, looking at this NAM sounding for the afternoon, I would suspect that that's what we see. Not really a lot in the way of a strong warm nose here that might, impede convective development early on. This would be a sounding favorable for early convection. So we'll have to watch that and see how it plays out. Not a ton of a true elevated mixed layer here, but we do have quite a bit of drier air aloft. Which may lead to kind of in that period between when the initial shortwave for the Friday event moves off to the northeast, before the Saturday wave kind of moves in, we'll be in a little bit of a lull with maybe a lack of forcing overall, other than just some warm advection showers perhaps. So that may keep things at bay instead, instead of having a very strong warm nose, the lack of forcing overall through the morning hours on Saturday between the shortwave from Friday and the wave on Saturday. I'll show you what I mean here real quick. So as the Friday shortwave ejects off to the northeast, and before this Saturday wave moves in, we'll kind of be in this lull in between the two with not a lot of forcing to initiate actual storms here until that trough moves closer going into the afternoon on Saturday. So that may be enough to hold things off going into the afternoon. But I think the European model might be the model that's showing. So we'll see here. I'll take a look at the precipitation here on the Euro, because I suspect it's initiating a lot of convection. So you see here, this is 15Z, 10 a.m. Central, and it's just got a blob of convection across much of the warm sector here. So that would not be a setup that would favor significant severe weather, as we'll just have a lot of convection, a lot of clustered linear type convection out here, ruining the warm sector for most of the day. Let's see what the NAM has for its precipitation output. We'll take a look at convective precipitation signal and see. So let's see what the NAM has. So early on, the NAM does not have much of that early convection at all. Fairly pristine warm sector, and then by about 18 to 21Z, we get that more robust activity to develop out there across the warm sector. So NAM and GFS solutions would keep that warm sector more pristine for longer early on Saturday, allowing for a more pristine environment to support significant tornadic activity, or at least significant severe weather activity Saturday afternoon, whereas the Euro blows up a lot of that convection early on, ruining the warm sector, not allowing for a lot of real robust discrete tornadic activity. But definitely a lot of boxes being checked here for me as far as a big southeast setup for Saturday. We don't really have a bona fide elevated mixed layer, it doesn't look like, but we do have some drier air aloft, and a lack of overall forcing early on may keep the warm sector free and clear of convection early in the day to keep that warm sector pristine, especially if the NAM and GFS solution come to fruition. So if that happens, definitely a concern for Saturday would be multiple rounds of storms along the frontal zone back to the west. And I should mention that we have trended a little bit more toward a more meridionally oriented frontal zone back to the west. So you have your front back in here, your front/dry line, your moisture gradient, whatever you want to call it there. And so let's go back to the past several runs here. So this is going to be 21Z Saturday, so 4 p.m. Saturday. Watch what's happened here. We've gone from this, a more northeast to southwest slanted front, which with the southwesterly flow aloft, which certainly provides shear vectors more parallel to the boundary, to now a front that is a little bit more oriented north-south, which would mean a little bit more perpendicular orientation of the shear vectors with respect to the initiating boundary. Speaking of that, let's take a look at the shear vectors there. So still fairly parallel, but a little bit more perpendicularity between the initiating boundary and the shear vectors, which could lead to a little bit longer window along the cold front even for some semi-discrete supercells. Again, looking more in the open warm sector for your most intense supercell development, but something to watch certainly for the cold front back to the west with this setup on Saturday. So definitely a concerning look for Saturday. Then we go into Sunday. I'll zoom out here and we'll just take a quick look at Sunday right now, since that's still the farthest day out. So we're going to have more discrepancy here for Sunday. As we go into Sunday, more just broad southwesterly flow across this area. Looks to me like more will just have a continuation of the Saturday activity going into Sunday. Probably some continued activity off to the north as well on Saturday in the form of a QLCS that will probably just persist into Sunday. Going into the eastern seaboard states, probably should have plenty of moisture here out across these regions. Does get sapped a little bit, southern extent, best moisture for sure. Carolinas southward, Virginia, Carolinas southward. But there could be a risk as far north as Pennsylvania and New Jersey if good enough moisture makes its way up there. So this is going to be for the Carolinas on Sunday. Limited instability once again, but wind profiles would certainly be favorable for some tornadic activity as well as significant damaging winds in what could be a strongly forced squall line moving east into the eastern seaboard states on Sunday. So that is going to do it for this video. I know it kind of rambled on there for a little bit, but there's just a lot to talk about with this setup. Very complex setup, no question about that. So let's go ahead and recap again today across with our lead shortwave, low and severe threat across the Arklatex, mostly a large hail risk, maybe an outside chance of a tornado or two there. Threat shifts into the southeast tomorrow, very low end risk for that. And then we get into Friday. Friday is where we have the initiation of our real robust severe threat for the weekend. Broad area of enhanced risk, level 3 out of 5 there from Illinois, Iowa, southward into the southeast. Again, with so much forcing in play, I do suspect that we're going to see a very strongly forced squall line across this the northern half of the risk area, Missouri into Illinois, Iowa, perhaps as far north as southern Minnesota and Wisconsin. Farther south of that, things may hold off a little bit. Arkansas into northern Mississippi and Alabama, western Tennessee. Things may hold off a little bit until the evening when we get a little bit more glancing blow from the shortwave trough, a little bit less forcing down here, and we will have, it looks like, enough moisture to support perhaps supercell development down here in the evening to nighttime hours, Friday night into early Saturday morning. So that needs to be watched very closely. Still somewhat of a conditional threat, but that needs to be watched closely, as that could pose a risk for some tornadic activity there as kind of a precursor to the Saturday event. Here's the Saturday risk area right now, Louisiana into parts of Tennessee and Alabama. A very broad risk area there, and certainly things are coming together for perhaps a potent risk on Saturday. Could be a significant severe weather event there, including the threat for strong tornadoes. Still some things to be worked out. Again, we have quite a bit of model discrepancy as far as the geometry of the warm sector, early convection, but the NAM and GFS, if that solution comes to fruition, that would keep the warm sector fairly free and clear of convection until the afternoon, with a little bit less forcing overall, a little bit more just broad southwesterly flow and robust moisture across the region. If we get any confluence bands or shortwaves traversing the warm sector, that could be very concerning for discrete tornadic supercells on Saturday, but still some discrepancy in that and things that need to be worked out with that. But definitely keep an eye out on Saturday as perhaps the day to watch of this 3-day stretch. And then things continue probably in the form of a continuation of the squall line from Saturday going into the eastern seaboard states on Sunday. So definitely a lot to cover with this setup. We will be back on Friday morning with a new forecast discussion once we get some more data in. But for now, folks, brought a lot of folks under the gun for these severe weather threats Friday, Saturday, and Sunday. So definitely from the Midwest and Great Lakes all the way down into the eastern seaboard states, keep an eye on forecast. Keep an eye on your local National Weather Service office and the Storm Prediction Center. And keep those weather radios handy. Have multiple ways of receiving warnings, as things may get pretty nasty here this weekend. So with that, thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.